Reproductive Rights and Wrongs, Part 3, Chapter 2, The Malthusian Orthodoxy. The impact of population growth is a source of endless debate. There is a vast literature on the subject by demographers and economists, sociologists, and development planners. The subject not only involves the impact of population's growth per se, but problems of population distribution between urban and rural areas and imbalances in the age structure of populations. What emerges most strongly from the literature is the difficulty of generalizing on a global level. The impact of population growth differs from country to country and is influenced by a variety of factors. Yet the complexities of demographic research and the wide variation in scientific opinion have largely been screened from public view. Instead, Malthusian alarmists, who range from environmentalists like Paul Ehrlich to senior international technocrats like former World Bank President Robert McNamara, and the McNamara name, that's on dumpsters, by the way, in certain areas, command the widest public audience. While the population bomb briefly went out of fashion in the 1980s, it is very much back in vogue today. There are several reasons why the alarmist message enjoys such credibility. It not only makes good shock headlines in the press, but also draws under uh, deep undercurrents of parochialism, racism, elitism, and sexism, complementing the social Darwinist survival of the fittest view. The most extreme Malthusians even advocate that famine relief be cut to poor population-related countries, or to poor overpopulated countries. Uh, Let the unfit starve until their numbers are brought under control. In 1985, at the height of a major African drought, Colorado government Richard D. Lamb wrote in the New York Times that United States should stop giving emergency relief to the African countries that failed to reduce their population growth, since such aid would merely multiply empty stomachs. The fact that such suggestions are taken seriously is a sad commentary on just how far Malthusianism has penetrated our value system. So pervasive are its assumptions that many of us have internalized them without even realizing it. Only by understanding the basic fallacies of the Malthusians' approach can the way be cleared for a fresh look at the population problem. The alarmists draw their ideological inspiration from Thomas Malthus, the British clergyman turned economist who wrote in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Malthus maintained that unless restrained by preventive checks, human populations would double every 25 years. The result would be geometric growth 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, etc., outstripping the Earth's capacity for food production, which could at best be expected to increase in an arithmetic progression 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. Humans were, according to Malthus, little different from animals or plants in this respect. Their numbers would be held in check by the limited carrying capacity of the planet. Quote, the race of plants uh, and the race of animals shrink under this great restrictive law, he proclaimed, and man cannot by any effort of reason escape from it. Only misery, the poverty, famine, and pestilence brought on by overpopulation, supplemented by man-made deprivations of war and slaughter, would keep human numbers down. Malthus was wrong on two basic counts. First, contrary to his predictions, it is possible for populations to slow and ultimately be stable and ultimately to stabilize, not because our numbers are held in check by natural forces of famine and pestilence, but rather as a result of improvements in living standards and other social changes which alter the need for many children. Malthus' native land underwent such a demographic transition. Malthus' second mistake was to underestimate greatly the capacity of the earth to feed and clothe a growing human population. It is perhaps not surprising that someone writing at the close of the 18th century failed to foresee the tremendous advances in human productive powers that would soon unfold in both industry and agriculture, outstripping population growth. In fact, at least one school of economic history maintains that the crucial force behind technological change, the prime mover of economic progress, was none other than population growth. In their influential study, The Rise of the Western World, A New Economic History, historians Douglas North and Robert Thomas conclude that population growth spurred the institutional innovation which account for the rise of the Western world. Far from blocking any long-term improvement in mass living standards, population growth is thus seen by some historians as the basic explanation for such improvements. The modern-day proponents of population control have reinterpreted Malthusian logic, selectively applying it only to the poor majority in the Third World, and in some cases to ethnic minorities in the West. It is not a giant step from this partitioning of Malthusian laws to a similar partitioning in the realm of human rights. Upper and middle class people have the right to have the right to voluntary choice as to whether to bear a child. But the rights of poor people are subordinate to the overriding imperative of population control. In support of this scientific and ethical double standard, the new Malthusians point to the correlation between high birth rates and low living standards in the third world today. It is undoubtedly true that the third world countries generally have higher birth rates than industrialized ones, East and West, and that among third world countries, those with higher population growth tend to have lower per capita incomes. Drawing sustenance from this simple correlation, the Malthusians then move on to blame a host of complex social ills on overpopulation, with varying degrees of intellectual sophistication and according to the fashions of the time. Food for thought. In the 1960s and 70s, it was fashionable to to attribute hunger and food scarcity to overpopulation. World food production could not keep pace with the galloping growth of population, warned the Washington-based Environmental Fund in one of the last sophisticated applications of Malthusian logic. Quote, "The battle to feed all humanity is over," claimed Ehrlich. 1968 book, The Population Bomb, and goes on to say, "In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death. While computer projections such as the Club of Rome's famous limits to growth gave these dire predictions a pseudo respectability. Hard facts contradicted the projections, for the galloping horse of population had met its match in the steady march of new agricultural technologies. We were about to enter the era of food surplus. Tremendous advances in agricultural productivity means that today the world produces enough grain alone to provide every man, woman, and child on Earth with 3,000 calories a day, well above the 2,200 to 2,500 calorie average, considered a minimally acceptable dietary level. At least on a global scale, there is no shortage of food. So, with this being said, locally, obviously, the resources that you have can run dry. But on a population scale, that doesn't really seem that likely because you're not going to allow it to happen. You're going to work together to come up with the crops and etc. Most people aren't just going to just be a mass of people and let yourself die. Okay. Simple Malthusian arithmetic says that more mouths to feed means less food per person. This would be true if the supply of food was somehow fixed and unaffected by the size of a country's population. Okay, so at my job, there are sometimes two cooks, and each cook can prepare three uh meals on the burners. So I think it's a complete myth. If you've never worked in your life, then you might think, ah, yes, there's only two cooks, and there's like 100 people every day coming at the restaurant. They can't possibly keep up, which this is dumb logic. Okay. Uh, Okay. This would be true somehow. Okay. But food supplies are not fixed and can be influenced by population growth in positive ways. This is not only because population growth expands the labor force. Each additional mouth brings with it an additional pair of hands. But because the pressure of population on resources can induce technological and institutional change so as to raise output per person, economist Colin Clark, for example, sees population growth as the principal force behind the extensive clearing of land, drainage of swamps, and the introduction of better crops and manures, changes with uh, uh, changes which historians tend to describe as agricultural revolutions. There is, of course, no guarantee that population growth will automatically trigger corresponding increases in food production, but neither is there an iron law that ensures that it will not. Indeed, in the past 20 years, the output of major food crops has increased dramatically in every region of the world, mostly due to increases in yields rather than expansion in cropland. Food production has kept up with population growth except in parts of Africa. The claim of Malthusians, uh, notably Lester Brown of the World Watch Institute, that since 1984, per capita cereal production has declined in all major regions of the world, largely due to population growth, is seriously flawed. A closer look at the data by Tim Dyson reveals that per capita cereal output has not declined in Western Europe and Asia, home to two-thirds of humanity. However, uh, declines in output elsewhere are largely due to the unfavorable grain prices and the switch to other crops. As Dyson concludes, quote, overall global per capita food output during the last decade has increased at only a slightly lower rate than it did during the 1970s. World population growth does not appear to be outpacing food production. Today, most countries have enough food to meet the needs of their growing populations or the economic resources that with which to import it. Yet, even when food is plentiful, millions of people will go hungry. Well, this is because of the caste system. Mass excess does create poor because it automatically puts people in a selfish position to crush the underclass. So, yeah. They go hungry because individual families do not have land on which to grow food or the money with which to buy it. The main problem is not that there are too many people and too few resources, but rather that too few people monopolize too many resources. The problem is one of the absolute scarcity, but one of distribution. The unequal distribution of land is especially critical in many parts of the Third World, where the majority of the population still lives in rural areas. The agricultural laborer in Asia, the small subsistence farmer in Latin America, and the African peasant who must migrate seasonally to work on plantations or in the mines often live at the margin of survival. When crops fail or jobs are scarce, they do not have the cash to buy food, even when it is plentiful in the market. Even famines have more to do with poor people's inability to command access to food than its actual scarcity. During the Sahelian famine of the late 1960s and early 1970s in Africa, for example, almost all Sahelian countries had enough food to feed their population, had that been a government priority. In fact, agricultural exports from the area actually increased during the period. Famine is usually due to a breakdown in the economic and political institutions which ensure food security through the distribution of surplus to regions suffering shortages. Public knowledge and pressures are vital in getting governments to act. According to economist A.K. Sen, there has never been a large-scale famine in any country, rich or poor, that is a democracy with a relatively free press. Recent famines in Ethiopia and Somalia were largely caused by the ravages of civil war, aided and abetted by the Cold War policies of the United States and the former Soviet Union, not by population growth or natural disasters. But what about those countries in Africa where food production has not kept pace with population growth? The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that in 1989, 35 or 47 African countries dropped below the per capita food production levels they had achieved during 1978 9 to 81. At the same time, the continent has been experiencing the world's highest rates of population growth. If Malthus was wrong about most of the world, was he right about Africa? Africa's food crisis has less to do with high population growth than with low productivity. 60 to 80% of the African rural labor force worked at extremely low levels of productivity. The most common agricultural implement is the handheld hoe, little advanced since the Iron Age. Not surprisingly, African cereal yields have not risen nearly as fast as those in other parts of the Third World. One of the main reasons food productions has stagnated in that resources have been concentrated on growing cash crops, for example. This export-oriented policy can be traced back to the colonial period when peasants were made by the use of oppressive taxation or force if necessary to grow export crops. Subsequent research and development programs centered on the needs of commercial farmers and plantation managers, ignoring basic food crops and their producers, who were usually women. This time trend, this same trend continues today, with most African government giving low priority to peasant food production and neglecting women's role in agriculture. Instead, the focus is on plantations, state farms, and land settlement schemes, which produce export crops, often in cooperation with foreign agribusiness corporations. Since cash crops are typically grown on the best land, their expansion squeezes subsistence food producers into marginal areas, and the result is often land degradation and declining yields. Through state marketing boards, Aristotle's, uh, which set low prices for agricultural products, and biased taxation policies, African agriculture has also been bled to finance and development of urban areas and the luxurious lifestyles of elites. Meanwhile, foreign aid programs have tended to favor expensive imported technology over indigenous techniques and labor, and have pushed grandiose commercial schemes over the painstaking provision of training, credit, and input to the small female farmer or herder. In recent years, the process of structural adjustment has further undermined African food production. In response to the international debt crisis of the 1980s, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, have uh, have forced many third world countries to make major free market adjustments to their economies in order to receive new loans, which they have to pay back their debt. Governments have had to slash social expenditures, remove price subsidies for essential products, devalue their currencies, downsize the public sector, open their doors to foreign investment and products, and, in the case of agricultural, concentrate on export crops in order to earn foreign exchange. At the same time, prices for most agricultural products have been falling dramatically on the world market. By the 1989, prices were only 60 to 70% of their 1970s levels. Traditional African exports have been particularly hard hit. Countries have had to increase the volume of their agricultural exports in order to gain the same amount of foreign exchange. In other words, they have had to run just to stay in uh, place. In Ghana, where the World Bank claims adjustment is a success, the concentration of resources on export crops, especially cocoa, has weakened basic food production and promoted dependence on food imports. In many countries, the dismantling of state supports, which benefited small farmers, notably fertilizer subsidies and credit programs, has also contributed to declining food production. In some parts of Africa, a shortage of human labor ironically lies behind both low yields and high fertility rates. Colonial and post-colonial policies have not only favored export crops but have forced many men to migrate seasonally to work on plantations, in mines, or in urban areas. Women, the main food producers, are left behind to manage the fields on their own. And Burkina Faso, For example, during certain times of the year when young men migrate to raise cash for taxes and consumer needs, there is not enough labor to clear bush for new forms of or maintain wells, and food production suffers accordingly. Cash cropping has also increased women's workload, since they are expected to do virtually all the labor involved in food production, as well as the sowing and weeding of cash crops, controlled by male family members. The size of food harvest is often dependent not only on what the land will produce, but on how much work in the fields women can squeeze into their already busy days. Having many children to help in the fields is clearly a rational response to this situation. Contrary to conventional wisdom, low population densities in many parts of the African in Africa have served as a brake on food production, while high densities have often raised land productivity. The semi-arid Makos district in Kenya was considered an environmental disaster in the 1930s, requiring famine relief and food imports. The population of the district increased fivefold in the next 60 years, but in the 1990s, the environment was in much better shape than in the 1930s. Per capita agricultural production has increased with new technologies and farming systems, but soil erosion has been reversed or slowed with terracing, terra, uh, terracing, and the protection of trees. Although the decline in Africa's birth rate might help to relieve pressure on land and food supplies, it will never solve the more fundamental problems at the heart of the continent's agrarian crisis. Instead, major agricultural reforms are necessary. After independence, Zimbabwe, for example, experienced impressive increases in peasant food production by breaking white farmers' monopoly over rural credit and transportation facilities, and through fair pricing policies for agricultural inputs and produce. Unfortunately, however, the best land in Zimbabwe is still controlled by a small number of white farmers. The weight of the evidence shows that today is increasingly difficult for Malthusians to blame hunger on population growth. Instead, they now make the argument that the effort to feed our growing numbers is taking an unprecedented environmental toll, draining fossil fuels and water reserves, degrading and contaminating soils, destroying other species, forcing expansion into marginal lands and forested areas, and ultimately threatening the survival of the future generations. Quote, in the simplest terms, we are in a race to see if we can slow and eventually halt the population growth before local life support systems collapse, warns Lester Brown of the World Watch Institute. The Malthusians, of course, have a point. No one wants a world of standalone, standing room only, where every bit of land, drops of water, and unit of energy is pressed into producing sustenance for an endless expanding human mass. The population growth rates are coming down. The species is not likely to expand itself into oblivion. Moreover, while many of the environmentally harmful processes the Malthusians describe are real and extremely serious, they have less to do with population growth than with specific consumption patterns, land uses, and agricultural technologies. There is a vast difference, for example, between the land degradation caused by corporate grain farming in the United States, much of which goes to feed livestock, and small-scale labor-intensive rice cultivation in Asia, which feeds millions of people. Given that world population will continue to grow into the next century, there is a pressing need for policy changes and new agricultural techniques, which will increase yields of basic food crops while restoring, not destroying, environmental resources. Okay, so if you've gotten this far, like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. In fact, get me up to 100, because I don't know, like I had 96 and then boom, they left. Anyways, many small farmers and peasants already practice sustainable agriculture, but their expertise and capacity for innovations have been largely overlooked or actively undermined by corporate agriculture. To guarantee food security, we should be spending time, energy, and money on both preserving traditional knowledge systems and developing new environmentally sensitive agricultural techniques, not on spreading unproductive alarm about birth rates. Unfortunately, alarm is the rallying cry of the Malthusian wing of the environmental movement. World population is already overshooting the carrying capacity of the planet. Their spokespeople warn us, but what exactly is their concept of population? And how do they measure carrying capacity? Specious views of the species. Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich has probably done more than any other single scientist to legitimize and popularize the belief that overpopulation is the main cause of the environmental crisis, from global warming to the depletion of the ozone layer. Like many biologists, he sees the human species through the same lens with which he views animals and plants populations, which multiply beyond the carrying capacity of their environments and subsequently die off. Thus, his latest book, co-authored with Anne Ehrlich, The Population Explosion, compares the exponential growth of human populations to that of pondweed, and and warns that nature may end the population explosion in very unpleasant ways, such as famine and AIDS, if people do not act immediately. The Ehrlichs believe that virtually every nation is already vastly overpopulated. By their definition, carrying capacity is the capacity of their environment to sustain human activities. And, quote, if the long-term carrying capacity of an area is clearly being degraded by its current human occupants, that area is overpopulated. By this logic, the land degradation caused by a uranium mine on a Native American reservation is a sign that the area has too many people. The Ehrlich's narrow view of the human species not only ignores historical changes in demographic dynamics, but the great cultural and temporal differences in how human populations relate to their environments. The Ehrlichs would like us to believe that from the time of the woolly mammoths, humans have degraded the ecosystem. In fact, many cultures have long lived in harmony with their natural surroundings. The current era of widespread environmental devastation is tied primarily to a unique and hopefully transitory period of rapacious capital accumulation and commodity fetishism spreading outward from the United States, Europe, and Japan. The pondweed view of the species reinforces racism and sexism. The white middle class elite to which the Ehrlichs and many other population controllers advocates belong is unlikely to view itself in these terms. Instead, the metaphor extends primarily to the dark-skinned poor. In the population explosion, the Ehrlichs refer to babies born in Bangladesh and Philippines as mouths, a common Malthusian slur. Implicitly, it is a woman's fertility which is out of control. It is as if women have never consciously exercised control over reproduction, except in modern family planning programs. Furthermore, only people who are profoundly alienated and insulted and insulated from the realities of human suffering can view famine or AIDS as nature's way of controlling population. As noted above, there is nothing natural about famine. The rapid spread of HIV in marginalized communities around the world is a direct result of their poverty and lack of power. Surely, a failure of resource distribution rather than a revenge of abstract nature on the overbreeding poor. Ehrlichs and many other Malthusian environmentalists use a simple equation to support their view of the world. The impact of any human group on the environment equals population size. P times the level of affluence or average individual resource consumption. A times an index of the environmental disruptiveness of the technologies which provide the goods consumed, T, or IPAT. Taking the equation at face value, people can and do argue that the relative weights that should be attracted to P, A, and T, even though the Ehrlichs recognize the environmental destruction caused by affluence and technology, they inevitably return to population as the main factor. Critics, of course, point out that affluence has far more to do with the depletion of natural resources than does population size. Currently, the industrialized nations, with 22% of the world's population, consume 70% of the world's energy, 75% of its metals, 85% of its wood, and 60% of its food. The much smaller populations of northern industrialized nations generate almost three-quarters of all carbon dioxide emissions, which in turn comprise nearly half of the man made greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They are also responsible for most of the ozone depletion. Other critics, notably environmentalist Barry Commoner, argue convincingly that the nature of technology is the divisive factor determining environmental quality. Commoner points to the critical shift from more environmentally benign technologies to more harmful ones. For example, from rail freight to truck freight, natural products to synthetics, reusable goods to throwaways, which occurred in the post World War II period. On a global level, when it simply does not make sense to blame environmental degradation on population growth. The main problem with the equation, however, is what it leaves out, namely the question of social, economic, and political power and the systems by which current power relations are enforced. These underlie P, A, and T, and the interactions between them. Take P, for example. The very word population lumps all people together, reducing them into a set of statistics or bloodless entities that can be managed as characterless classes that produce, produce, or consume, and for the common good call for control. In her critique of IPAT, environmentalist Ace Patricia Haynes notes that P is gender, race, and class blind, all but ignoring different people's different impacts on the environment. Moreover, it neglects the crucial factor of human agency by viewing all humans as takers from, rather than enhancers of, the natural environment. This truncated cultural bound view of humans in their environment originates from an industrial urban consumer society. P also ignores the issue of population distribution, which arguably can have greater impact on the environment than population size per se. Millions of people crowded in megacities, particularly when they are located in environmentally vulnerable areas like Southern California, where they drive cars, can do far more damage to the environment than if they were more evenly distributed in towns and smaller cities. Carefully planned urbanization, on the other hand, is often more environmentally sound than unplanned suburbanization, which consumes farmlands and forests. And precisely what is A? Affluence is not simply a matter of per capita consumption. Profound systemic inequalities underlie consumption patterns. Debt repayment, structural adjustment, and the free market economics of the 1980s and 1990s have meant that even greater concentration of the wealth in the hands of the rich. According to the United Nations Human Development Report 1993, global income disparity has doubled during the last decades. The richest 20% of the world's people now receive 150 times the income of the poorest 20%, who receive in a total a measly 1.3% of global income. In terms of both inequality and quality of consumption, advanced capitalism carefully orchestrates needs through mass advertising, destroying non-commodity based cultural and values. Unregulated and unchecked, it seeks endlessly to expand production and open new markets. But unchecked growth comes at a cost. Not only are many poor people left by the wayside, unemployed or in marginal jobs, but for the privileged consumerism does not live up to its promises. Psychologist Paul Watchell presents survey evidence that shows that Americans are no happier today than they were 20 to 30 years ago, even though they now have a higher standard of living. He asks, quote, "Why is it that growth has yielded us so little in enduring satisfaction? to begin with, the entire dynamic of the growth-oriented economy absolutely requires discontent. If people begin to be satisfied with what they have, if they cease to organize their lives around having still more, the economy is in danger of grinding to a halt. Progress is in our most important product. Dis Oh, sorry, progress is not our most important product. Discontent is. So, I have to get going soon. So, I will see you in the next one.